When we first began our discussion of the brain, we learned there are four functional parts of the brain: the brain stem, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and now that brings us to the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the part of the brain that makes you, you. It's what makes us all different. The cerebrum is the part of the brain where we have the seat of intelligence, you could say. It provides us with the ability to read, to write, to speak, to listen, to taste, to smell, to make calculations and decisions, and to use logic, to compose music and create art, to remember the past, to plan for the future, to have ideas, to create. So when we look at the cerebrum, we have several different areas that we'll talk about. So the cerebrum itself is composed of billions of neurons, and the outermost part of the cerebrum is known as the cortex. That's going to be an area of gray matter, and then an internal region of cerebral white matter, and then located within the white matter we'll have several gray nuclei that are located deep within the white matter. Now remember, nuclei is going to be a mass of cell bodies in the central nervous system. So the gray matter again makes up that outer part of the cerebrum that we'll call the cortex, and we'll begin by looking at that. The cortex is made up of bumps and bulges and grooves, and we'll learn what those are as well. So the cerebrum makes up the superior part of the brain, about 83% of the brain mass. We have bumps and bulges that are called gyri. So all of these are gyri. So those are the elevated ridges or bumps. Gyrus, G-Y-R-U-S, is singular. Gyri is plural. Now where all of these bumps and bulges form these elevated areas, there are grooves or little indentions between them. Those are known as sulci. So the sulci are the shallow grooves between the gyri. Sulcus, S-U-L-C-U-S, is singular, so each one of these little grooves is a sulcus. We have really deep grooves that are known as fissures. So fissures are going to be something that makes a major division between areas. So if you look here at the brain, you can see we have the left hemisphere or the left half, the right hemisphere or the right half, and separating these two is a deep groove that is called the longitudinal fissure. Okay, so it separates the brain into a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. You'll also see when we look at a lateral view of the brain, or if you look at an entire brain, you'll see a transverse fissure. Do you remember what transverse means? Of course you do. Transverse means across. So the transverse fissure is going to separate the cerebrum and the cerebellum. It's here in this longitudinal fissure that we have that extension of the cranial dura. Remember, the dura mater surrounds the brain and is that tough fibrous outer covering. Where that dura extends down between the two hemispheres is the falx cerebri. Remember, that was one of our structures we learned. And also connecting the right and left hemisphere is a very broad, thick band of white matter that contains axons that extend between the two hemispheres and allow for communication between them. When we're looking at the anatomy of the cerebrum, we divide the cerebrum into lobes that are named after the bones that cover them. So think back to when you learned cranial bones. The frontal bone was here at the forehead. Okay, so the frontal lobe of the brain, the occipital lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe. So far, everything looks familiar, right? But there's also a fifth lobe that is known as the insula. So the insula can't be seen on the surface because it lies deep within the parietal, frontal, and temporal lobes. But here you can see it drawn in so that you can get an idea of the location. Before we begin a discussion of the cerebral cortex, let's look at some of the other areas of the brain. So we'll begin by looking at the cerebral white matter, which is made up of myelinated axons that we find in 3 different types of fiber tracts. These fiber tracts are classified based on the way that the fiber runs. Commissural tracts contain axons that conduct impulses from one cerebral hemisphere to the other cerebral hemisphere. So as we mentioned a while ago, the corpus callosum was that band of white fibers that connects the right and left hemispheres. So it's the largest fiber bundle in the brain and made up of about 300 million fibers. So here you can see the brain has been divided into a sagittal section. So you're looking at the left hemisphere, and here is the corpus callosum. So that is the commissure that connects the right and left hemispheres. Looking at a frontal view, you can see here that it is also going to or you can see more clearly, I guess you should say, how it's going to connect the 2 hemispheres. So right there is your corpus callosum. Association tracts are made up of fibers that are going to connect different parts within the same hemisphere. So we'll see a few of those as we look at some of the association areas of the brain. And then projection fibers contain axons that conduct nerve impulses from the cerebrum to lower parts of the central nervous system, such as the thalamus, the brainstem, or the spinal cord, or from lower parts of the central nervous system to the cerebrum. So the white matter is going to be made up of these myelinated axons, remember, that are forming tracts that allow for communication from one area of the brain or the central nervous system to others. Basal nuclei are gray masses or masses of gray matter that are located deep within each cerebral hemisphere. So they receive input from the cerebral cortex and help initiate and terminate movements or suppress unwanted movements, and also help to regulate muscle tone. We have 3 major basal nuclei, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. You won't have to identify those if you're in my class, but those are 3 examples of those. So let's look at this anterior section of the brain. You can see the outer part, which is made up, of course it's brown on here, but the darker color is gray matter. And then you can see the white matter, those myelinated axons making up fiber tracts. There's our corpus callosum. And these structures that are colored brown and different shades of blue within this section of the brain are representing the basal nuclei, or that gray matter that is deep within the white matter. Disorders like Parkinson's disease or obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, chronic anxiety are thought to involve dysfunction of the circuits between the basal nuclei and the limbic system. Now we'll talk a little bit more about that when we move into different areas of the brain, including the sensory, motor, and integrative or association functions of the brain. And before we move into the cerebral cortex, let's look at a couple of functional brain systems. So these are neuronal networks that span large distances within the brain. In this image you can see a sagittal section of the brain, and most of the colored area that you see here is going to be a part of the limbic system. So we'll look just briefly at the limbic system and then the reticular activating system. So encircling a part of the brain stem and the corpus callosum is a ring of structures that form the inner border of the cerebrum and the floor of the diencephalon, and all that area together is a part of the limbic system. So there are several structures within the limbic system. The ones that you've probably heard about are the hippocampus and the amygdala, and then of course the olfactory bulbs, which are bodies of the neuronal cells that help to produce the sense of smell. The limbic system is sometimes called the emotional brain because it plays such a vital role in the range of emotions, including pain and pleasure, affection, and anger. It's also, as I mentioned, involved in the sense of smell and also in memory. Together with parts of the cerebrum, the limbic system functions in memory, and then damage, of course, to that limbic system can cause memory impairment. One portion of the limbic system, the hippocampus, has cells that are supposedly capable of undergoing mitosis. Now remember, we talked about how in the central nervous system most cells don't regenerate or undergo mitosis to create new cells, but some of the latest research indicates that hippocampal cells may be able to do so. And because of that, some aspects of memory may be able to develop new neurons even within the elderly. A second functional brain system we want to examine briefly is the reticular activating system, sometimes called the reticular formation. So it's a net-like structure of gray fibers or gray matter and white matter within the brain stem, not within the cerebrum, but we consider it here as we're looking at these functional areas. The most important function of the reticular activating system is maintaining consciousness, or a state of wakefulness where we're alert and aware and oriented as to what is going on around us. The RAS, reticular activating system, also prevents sensory overload or excessive visual and or auditory stimulation by filtering out insignificant information so it doesn't reach your consciousness. For instance, think about when you're sitting in the classroom and you're listening to your instructor's lecture. You're paying attention to that lecture. You're not necessarily hearing the traffic that goes by outside. You're not necessarily hearing when the air conditioning or the heating system comes on. So the RAS filters out some of that information. You don't feel your clothes on your body. You're not aware of the pressure of your finger against that pen that you're using to take notes. So all of that is creating a pathway of perception in the brain. You have a stimulus, you are able to feel something, but the RAS filters it out so that we don't have that overload of sensation at all times. Inactivation of the reticular activating system produces sleep, which is a state of partial consciousness from which you can be aroused pretty easily. Damage to the RAS, on the other hand, can result in coma, which is a state of unconsciousness where you can't be roused. In the lightest stages of coma, the brainstem and the spinal cord reflexes are still there, so you can still reflexively respond to stimulus. But in a deep coma, those reflexes are lost. That's vitally important, especially if you think about the reflexes that are responsible for your respirations and your cardiovascular system, keeping your heart beating. So if those controls are lost, then the patient typically dies. Some drugs, such as melatonin, affects the reticular activating system by helping us to get to sleep. General anesthetics can turn off the consciousness by inactivating the reticular activating system. LSD is a drug that causes sensory overload. So by shutting down the sort of filter part of the RAS, all of those sensations flood the brain, and of course that can lead to hallucinations. Alright, so now let's begin our discussion of the cerebral cortex, the outer gray matter of the brain. So the cerebral cortex is our conscious mind. It makes up about 40% of our brain mass. It's made up of gray matter that contains cell bodies and dendrites, unmyelinated axons, but no fiber tracts. Within the cerebral cortex, we have sensory areas that receive sensory input, and they're also involved in perception, the conscious awareness of a sensation. There are motor areas that control the execution of voluntary movements, and integrative or association areas that deal with complex putting things together and integrating functions such as memory and emotions, reasoning, judgment, personality, and intelligence. The two hemispheres of the cerebral cortex are also said to be contralateral in that each hemisphere contains cortex that functions, that causes or deals with functions on the opposite side of the body. So contra, opposite, lateral, side. So areas of the cerebral cortex on the right side deal with functions of the body on the left side, and vice versa. So on your next test, I'm going to give you this image, and you're going to have to label all 45 of these areas. No way. Are you kidding? I couldn't even do that if I had to. I'd get most of them, but we are going to talk about some of these areas of the brain. This image does give you a visual for a lot of the areas that we'll be talking about, whether they are sensory, motor, or they are association areas. We'll begin by talking about sensory areas of the brain. So in the cerebral cortex, primary sensory areas receive information that's been relayed from peripheral sensory receptors through lower regions of the brain. The association areas that we'll see are going to be usually adjacent or very close to the primary sensory areas. Sensory association areas integrate sensory experiences to generate something that's meaningful to us by associating with patterns of recognition and awareness. For example, if you had damage to a primary visual area, you would be blind in at least part of a visual field. But a person with damage to a visual association area would be able to see but not make sense of it. So you might not recognize your toothbrush, or you might not recognize your computer. You could see it, the sight stimulus is there, but the association would be lacking. So as we look at these three categories, sensory, remember, is going to bring information in, so it's responsible for detecting that sensory information, bringing it to the brain for integration or association in the association areas. That means compare it to something you know and make sense of it, and then the motor areas can cause an action to occur. The primary somatosensory area receives nerve impulses for touch, pressure, tickle, temperature, vibration, pain, joint and muscle position, and is involved in the perception of these somatic sensations. The primary somatosensory area also allows you to pinpoint where a somatic sensation is coming from, so you know exactly on your arm where that little spider is crawling. The size of the area of the cortex that's receiving impulses from a particular area of the body depends on the numbers of receptors that are present. So a particular body part doesn't necessarily mean, or a large particular body part doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a large amount of the cortex associated with that. For instance, think about your fingertips and how many receptors there must be in order for you to feel the slightest little touch and all of the information that you process through your fingertips, as compared to, say, your calf. Your calf is much larger than your fingertips, but much more of the cortex is associated with the fingertips than the calf. So much more cortex in those areas where we have a lot of sensation. The somatosensory association area integrates sensory input. Now remember, primary somatosensory is going to bring information in. It helps us to feel things, to sense things. The association area helps us to determine what that sensory input is. Is it hot? Is it cold? It also helps you to be able to identify the exact shape or texture of something just by feeling it. It also is useful, or is playing a role in the storage of memories of past somatosensory events. It enables you to compare what you currently feel with something that you've previously experienced. For example, if you put your hand on you pick up your pencil, you identify that because you know that is a pencil. You don't have to look at it. If you reach your hand in your pocket and you feel your car keys, you don't have to take those car keys out and look at them to know it's car keys. You are able, because of the somatosensory association area, to understand what that is because you have felt it before. The primary visual area receives visual information and is involved in the perception of that. The visual association area relates present and past experiences and it's essential for recognizing and evaluating what's seen. So it allows you to recognize an object, such as a book, simply by looking at it. The primary auditory areas receive information for sound, and they're involved in the auditory perception. The auditory association area allows you to recognize particular sounds, such as music, noise, or speech. The olfactory sensory area of the cortex is going to receive impulses for smell and involved in olfactory perception, and allows you to identify different odors and to be able to discriminate among different odors. For instance, you know the difference in the smell of chocolate chip cookies baking in the oven versus apple pie baking in the oven. The gustatory cortex receives information for taste and helps you to perceive or discriminate among taste. Again, you know when you put something in your mouth if it is chocolate chip cookie or apple pie. The vestibular cortex helps you to have an awareness of balance. So the stimulus is, of course, the tension or the position of muscles and bones in the body, and the awareness of whether or not you are standing upright or lying down or climbing a hill is processed in that association area of the vestibular cortex. The visceral sensory area provides us with an awareness of the organs. Viscera, of course, means organ. So we can detect if we have a stomach ache differently than if our bladder is full and we need to go to the bathroom. Quite simply, the primary motor cortex, made up of large neurons that control voluntary skeletal movements, such as the contraction of the biceps brachii when you flex your arm. The premotor cortex is truly a motor association area. It communicates with the primary motor cortex. The sensory association areas, and all of this information is put together so that we have the ability to do activities that require a complex or sequential nature. So it causes a specific group of muscles to contract in a specific sequence, such as the typing or writing or playing a musical instrument. Broca's area is involved with speech. So speaking and understanding language are very complex activities that involve sensory, association, and motor areas of the cortex. In most of the population, in fact about 97%, these areas, Broca's areas, are language areas located within the left hemisphere. So Broca's controls the movements of the muscles of the larynx, the pharynx, and the mouth. The coordinated contractions of your speech and breathing enable you to speak. People who suffer from a CVA, cerebrovascular accident, or a stroke in this area can still have clear thoughts, but because the inability to control those muscles of speech, they're unable to form the words. And the motor cortex, the frontal eye field, helps to control your voluntary eye movement, just like the muscles that you are using as you are watching this video and looking back and forth from the paper that you're making notes on to the screen. Now remember, primary motor cortex controls those voluntary muscles. So someone with damage to the primary motor cortex would lose voluntary muscle control, but the reflexes would still be able to respond. And because of the contralateral feature or the contralateral nature of the cerebral cortex, a stroke in the right hemisphere could lead to paralysis on the left side of the brain. On the other hand, someone with damage to the premotor cortex would lose those programmed motor skills. So the muscles could still do what they needed to do, but the ability to type might be lost. So the muscles of the fingers could still perform the task, but the brain would have to relearn how to do that. So we've looked at sensory and motor. Let's look now at association areas. Remember, an association or integrative area is where you make sense of something. So even though you may smell mom's apple pie baking, without associating or integrating that information, it may not mean anything to you. If you don't know what apple pie is, and you don't know that you love mom's apple pie, and you don't know that, oh, perhaps you liked Granny's apple pie better than mom's, but we won't tell her that. So the anterior association area, sometimes called the prefrontal cortex, is a very, very complicated area that's concerned with the makeup of a person's personality, their intellect, complex learning abilities, being able to remember and recall information, your initiative, your judgment, reasoning, conscious, intuition, your mood, being able to plan for the future and to have goals, and the ability to develop very abstract ideas. So a person with damage to the prefrontal cortex may become rude, inconsiderate, or completely the opposite of what they once were. An example of this is often studied in psychology, and that's the famous case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who had an accident, and a metal rod stuck through his head and injured his prefrontal cortex. Now remember, that's where your personality is seated, right? So Phineas was a very responsible man, always at work and doing the right thing in his life and in his community. But after this accident, Phineas became mean. He didn't work. He was a cheat and a crook and a scoundrel. So remember that prefrontal cortex is really where you are. That's everything that makes you you. The posterior association is sometimes called Wernicke's area, and it interprets the meaning of speech by recognizing spoken words. It's active as you translate words into thought and adding emotional content to those, such as anger or joy, to spoken words. If someone says something to you and they tell you your shoes are ugly, that may really make you mad because you saved for a long time to be able to buy those shoes. Or someone says, oh, those are the coolest shoes I've ever seen, that may make you very happy. So you're adding emotion to those words that you hear. Now, unlike those that have cerebrovascular accidents in Broca's area, people who suffer strokes in Wernicke's area can still speak, but they can't arrange those words into a coherent pattern. So this is sometimes called fluent aphasia, or simply called word salad. For instance, someone may look at your shoes, and if they have damage in Wernicke's area, they may say, shoes purple clouds like pizza, when really what they wanted to say was, I really like your shoes. And then the limbic association takes all of the sensory input and puts it into an emotional thought, such as, again, you smell that apple pie, you associate that with a memory, you remember that you liked it, and you know how happy it makes mom when you brag on her apple pie. So that's an emotional thought. That's processed in the limbic association area. Another example of how these areas of the cortex are related to each other, think about the visual areas. So if someone has damage to the primary visual cortex, then they're not receiving that visual stimulus, and the result is blindness. However, someone with damage to the visual association area can see. They're receiving that stimulus through the retina, being processed and taken into the cortex, but they can't comprehend what they see because the association area is damaged. Although the brain is almost symmetrical on its right and left sides, the hemispheres, there are subtle anatomical differences between the two hemispheres. In some people, different areas of the brain, such as Wernicke's, may be larger on one side than the other. There's a difference or asymmetry in the fetus as young as about 30 weeks of gestation. There are also physiological differences. The two hemispheres share performance of many functions, but each hemisphere specializes in performing certain functions. This functional asymmetry is termed hemispheric lateralization. So despite some dramatic differences in function between the two hemispheres, there's considerable variation from person to person. Lateralization is less pronounced in females than males. So there has to be something going on with estrogen and testosterone there, right? In females, you find that they are less likely than males to suffer aphasia, or the inability to talk, after damage to the left hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is typically going to be primarily responsible for processing language, math, logic, whereas the right hemisphere has more of the visual and spatial relation skills, the artistic and musical skills, and emotion. So on the next slide, and warning, it's a very wordy slide, we'll see some of those functions as divided out between the hemispheres. So as we mentioned briefly, you can see the right hemisphere is going to receive and control the muscles on the left side of the body, whereas the left hemisphere receives information and controls the right side of the body. So remember, contralateral, receiving stimulus and controlling the opposite side. The right side is more responsible for functions associated with music and art and space and patterns and spatial relationships, recognizing faces and emotional content of those facial expressions. So you can see someone and look at them and know if they're happy or they're sad. The right side also helps to generate emotional content of the language we speak and we hear, helps us to identify and discriminate among odors. And then, of course, we've already mentioned the damage to Broca's and Wernicke's. The left side is more responsible for reasoning, numerical and scientific skills, the ability to use and understand sign language, spoken and written language, and persons with damages in the left hemisphere often exhibit aphasia. And I'm sure I've mentioned this before, but just to make sure you know what aphasia is, that's the loss of the ability to express yourself through speech. Brain waves indicate electrical activity in the cerebral cortex. Brain waves generated by the neurons close to the brain surface, of course, and we know that's the cortex, can be detected by sensors called electrodes that are placed on the forehead and the scalp. A record of these brain waves is called an electroencephalogram, or for short, EEG. The brain produces 4 types of brain waves. You can see an example of an EEG and those 4 types of waves here in this image. We'll talk about each one of those in just a moment and define what they are and when you normally see them. But what's the use in an EEG anyway? Well, they're useful in studying the normal brain and brain functions, such as changes that occur during sleep, but also useful in diagnosing a variety of brain disorders such as epilepsy or trauma, hematoma, some metabolic abnormalities, and degenerative diseases. The EEG is also utilized to see if life is present or to establish whether or not brain death has occurred. In epileptic seizures, there are electrical discharges in groups of neurons of the brain that prevents the normal signals from getting through. So it's a very disorganized series of firings of electrons, so disorganized electrical activity. Now let's look briefly at those 4 classifications of waves that are the typical brain waves that we see in an EEG. Alpha waves are present in the EEGs of nearly all normal individuals when they're awake or resting with their eyes closed. These waves disappear when we're sleeping. Beta waves appear when the nervous system is active, so when sensory input is coming in and we have mental activity. Theta waves normally occur in children and adults experiencing emotional distress. And then the delta waves are present during deep sleep in adults, but they're normal in awake infants. They're produced in when you see them produced in an awake adult, they may indicate brain damage. And finally, here we have a slide that gives you some very basic information that we've covered for the summary of the functions of the cerebrum. So remember, we have those sensory, motor, and association areas. The basal nuclei that are going to be responsible for regulating movements. The limbic system that is responsible for emotion, and don't forget to add in here the reticular activating system, even though it's really a part of the brain stem. We looked at it with some of those functional brain systems and talked about the RAS role in consciousness.